Grace Whitfield's hands were shaking when she knocked on the office door, and it had nothing to do with the baby pressing against her ribs. "I'll do anything," she said, standing in the doorway of Ravello's bakery, 8 months pregnant, her coat too thin for the Providence cold outside. "Dishes, deliveries, cleaning after clothes. I don't care what it is. I just need work." Nico Ravello looked up from a stack of invoices, and for a moment he almost said no. His bakery ran lean, and hiring a woman this far along made no practical sense. Then 2 men crossed the parking lot outside his window, laughing about something unremarkable in every way except for what happened next. Grace flinched. Not startled, recognized. Her whole body went rigid, her hand dropping instinctively to shield her stomach, her eyes fixed on the men like she was watching something that had already hurt her once before. It was gone in a second. She composed herself, met his eyes again, waited for his answer like nothing had happened. But Nico had built an empire on noticing exactly the things people tried to hide, and that flinch didn't belong to a woman simply hoping for work. It belonged to someone who'd seen those 2 men before, somewhere that mattered. "You're hired," he said. "Start tomorrow." Grace blinked, thrown by how easy it was. Just like that. Just like that. He didn't tell her the real reason, that he needed her close enough to find out exactly what she wasn't saying, and why the sight of Sal Marchetti's crew crossing his own parking lot had turned a pregnant stranger's face the color of ash. She thanked him 3 times on her way out, awkward and grateful, and Nico sat alone afterward turning over what he'd just seen. In 11 years running the family business, the bakery that fed half the neighborhood and the other darker business that fed his real income, he'd learned to read fear the way other men read newspapers. Grace Whitfield's fear wasn't generic poverty and desperation fear. It was specific, targeted, aimed at 2 men who worked, however loosely, for him. He pulled up the address she'd left on her application. A modest apartment on the east side, 6 months into widowhood, a name, Daniel Whitfield, that meant nothing to him personally but that made something cold settle in his stomach when he checked the date of death against a night he remembered clearly. A robbery gone wrong, a man shot for cash and a wristwatch, filed and closed by police within a week as random and unsolvable. Nico had never once questioned that file. He was starting now. She showed up the next morning at 6 sharp, flour-dusted apron already tied, moving through the bakery's early routine like she'd worked there for years instead of hours. She was careful in a way that went beyond exhaustion, watching the door, watching the parking lot, positioning herself so she always had a clear line to the back exit. Nico watched her from the office doorway and understood, with the particular clarity that came from a decade of reading Dangerous Rooms, that whatever Grace Whitfield was running from, it hadn't stopped running after her. And if her fear really was connected to Sal, a man who'd sat at Nico's own table for 10 years, who'd buried Nico's father, who Nico trusted with his life, then he had just hired a woman who might be able to prove that his own organization had killed an innocent man. He didn't know yet how right he was. He only knew, watching her steady hands work dough she couldn't afford to waste, that he wasn't going to let her walk back out that door until he understood exactly what she was hiding from. Grace Whitfield was 31 years old, and everything she had left in the world fit into a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Providence's east side. A crib she'd assembled alone at 2 in the morning, a closet of maternity clothes bought secondhand, and a shoebox of medical bills she couldn't look at without her chest going tight. 6 months ago, her husband Daniel had been walking home from his shift at the hardware store when 2 men jumped him outside a parking garage. The police report called it a robbery, cash and a watch, nothing more, a tragedy as common and forgettable as Providence winters. Grace had believed it too at first, in the numb weeks after the funeral when believing anything else felt like more grief than she could survive. But she'd been 3 blocks away that night, walking home from her own late shift at the diner, and she'd seen 2 men running from that same parking garage minutes before the ambulance arrived, seen their faces clearly enough under a streetlight that she still saw them behind her eyes some nights, still heard one of them laugh, an ugly, careless sound, like nothing important had just happened. She hadn't told the police. She'd been too afraid, too pregnant, too aware that a grieving widow's eyewitness account against 2 strangers she couldn't name meant nothing except painting a target on her own back. So she'd buried it the way she'd buried everything else that year and told herself survival mattered more than justice. Survival lately has gotten harder. Daniel's life insurance had barely covered the funeral. Her diner job had let her go once she couldn't hide the pregnancy behind the counter anymore, citing liability concerns nobody bothered to write down. She was 6 weeks from a due date and 4 weeks from being unable to make rent. And she had exactly one skill that still felt like hers. She was a baker, had been since she was 14, and her grandmother taught her in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and safety, long before either of those things became rare. Her rule, the one she repeated to herself on the worst nights, was simple. She did not owe anyone anything she hadn't earned honestly. Her mother had spent years trapped by a man who'd used generosity as a leash, and Grace had watched that lesson land hard enough to reshape her entire adult life. She would rather go hungry than let anyone buy their way into owning a piece of her decisions. She kept one object from before everything fell apart. Daniel's watch, or rather the replacement she'd bought herself after his was stolen the night he died. A cheap thing from a pharmacy rack that meant more to her than anything expensive ever could, because it was the last gift she'd ever be able to give him, even secondhand, even too late. The morning she walked into Ravello's bakery, she'd already been turned away from 4 other places. One manager laughing outright at the idea of hiring someone about to pop. She'd stood outside the bakery for 10 minutes gathering the courage to ask, hand pressed to her stomach, whispering the same promise she made every day lately, I will figure this out. Always do. You are not going to grow up the way I did, wondering if we'll make it. Then she'd walked in and flinched at exactly the wrong moment, and watched a dangerous man's eyes sharpen on her like he'd caught her in a lie she hadn't spoken yet. She almost turned around and left. Something, desperation or maybe some instinct she didn't have the luxury of ignoring, kept her rooted in that doorway instead. That night, lying awake with the baby restless under her ribs, Grace turned the fake watch over in her hands and made a decision that would change everything. Though she didn't understand it yet, she would take the job. She would be careful, watchful, and would give this dangerous man nothing he could use against her. But she would not run again. She was tired of running. She was going to build something steady for her daughter, even if it meant working inside the shadow of the very danger she was trying to escape. She didn't know yet that the shadow and the danger were the same building. She didn't know that the man who'd just hired her was already digging into her husband's death with the same instincts that had built and protected his empire for over a decade. She only knew she needed the job, and she'd gotten it, and for the first time in 6 months, something that wasn't quite hoped had put down a small, stubborn root. Grace's second week at the bakery, Nico found a reason to be in the kitchen at closing. A reason he'd invented since he owned the building and had no real cause to be checking inventory himself. You're better than this job, he said, watching her shape dough with quick, practiced hands. Where'd you learn that? My grandmother. Before she passed. Grace didn't look up. Is there a problem with my work, Mr. Ravello? Nico. And no. I'm making conversation. You don't strike me as a man who makes conversation without a reason. It surprised a short laugh out of him, genuine, unguarded, the kind he didn't often let people see. Fair point. She finally looked at him directly, and Nico felt the same jolt he'd felt the first day, watching someone read him as clearly as he usually reads everyone else. Then ask me what you actually want to ask. He set down the clipboard he'd been using as an excuse. 2 men crossed my parking lot your first day here. You looked like you'd seen a ghost. Grace's hands stilled on the dough. The silence stretched long enough that Nico almost regretted pushing. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, too careful, too controlled. I think you do. He kept his voice gentle, deliberately non-threatening, the tone he used with frightened people he needed to trust him rather than fear him. I'm not asking to trap you, Grace. I'm asking because whatever scared you that day scared you enough that I've been thinking about it for a week. She studied him. Really studied him the way Nico imagined she'd studied every person who'd ever mattered to her survival, cataloging threat and safety with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to be wrong. Whatever she found in his face made something in her shoulders loosen just slightly. My husband died 6 months ago, she said. Police called it a robbery. Random, no suspects, case closed within a week. But you don't think it was random. I saw 2 men running from that parking garage before the ambulance got there. I saw their faces. Her voice dropped, careful even now. I've seen those same faces twice since I moved to this neighborhood. Both times walking in and out of this building. The floor of Nico's certainty about his own organization cracked wide open. Describe them, he said, already dreading the answer. She did. Height, build, one distinctive scar along a jawline. A particular way one of them favored his right shoulder when he walked, An old injury Nico recognized instantly, viscerally, because he'd been the one to send that man to a doctor for it 3 years ago. Sal Marchetti's crew. Nico said nothing for a long moment, his mind working through the horrifying arithmetic of what she'd just told him. That his own men who answered to him, might have killed an innocent civilian in what everyone had assumed was a random tragedy. And that the widow of that man was standing in his kitchen shaping dough because she had nowhere else to turn. "I need you to understand something," he said finally, low and direct. "If what you're telling me is true, that's not a coincidence you walked into. That's a debt I now owe you, whether either of us wanted it." "I don't want your money," Grace said immediately, fierce despite the fear still visible underneath it. "I've had enough people try to buy their way out of owing me something real. I want the truth. I want to know if the men who killed my husband are men you employ." "I want the same thing," Nico said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised even him. "Give me time to find out." Quietly. "If I move too fast, I tip them off before I have proof, and that puts you and your daughter in more danger, not less." "How do you know it's a girl?" "I don't," he admitted, the first crack of warmth breaking through his controlled exterior. "Lucky guess." She almost smiled, the first almost smile he'd seen from her, before the weight of everything settled back over her face. "If I help you find proof," she said, "what happens to me after? People who know too much about your business don't usually get to just walk away and raise a kid in peace." "They do if I have anything to say about it," Nico said. "You have my word. Whatever this costs, it doesn't cost you your freedom to walk away when it's over." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing a promise from a man she had every reason not to trust, made by a man whose own men might have killed her husband. "Okay," she said finally. "Then let's find out the truth." Neither of them said aloud what they were both already thinking. That the truth, once it surfaced, was going to be far more dangerous than the silence had ever been. Nico moved carefully over the following days, the way a man moves who understands that a wrong step could get someone killed. He didn't confront Sal directly. He pulled financial records instead, quietly cross-referencing the timeline of Daniel Whitfield's death against Sal's crew's movements that night. A debt collection that had gone sideways, according to the ledger, at an address 2 blocks from the parking garage where Daniel died. He also made sure, without discussing it with Grace first, that she was never alone walking to or from the bakery. A car appeared at the end of her block each morning, idling at a discreet distance, driven by a young man named Theo who worked bakery deliveries during the day and something considerably more serious for Nico after hours. Grace noticed within 2 days. "You're having me follow," she said, cornering him in the office, arms crossed over the growing curve of her stomach. "I'm having you protected. Those aren't the same thing and you know it." "They're the same thing right now," Nico said, matching her directness. "You just told me your husband might have been killed by my own men. If Sal so much as suspects you remember his face, you and your daughter become a loose end he can't afford to leave alive. I'm not asking your permission to keep you breathing, Grace. I'm telling you I'm doing it. You don't get to make that decision for me. I already made it. You can be angry about it, but you're not walking to that bakery alone until I know how deep this goes." She left the office rigid with fury, and Nico understood, watching her go, that he'd just made the same mistake every well-intentioned protector before him had made, deciding for her instead of with her. It sat uncomfortably in his chest for the rest of the day, an unfamiliar discomfort for a man used to giving orders that were simply obeyed. The external consequence arrived 4 days later, in the form of a phone call from his cousin Angela, who ran the bakery's books and had noticed the sudden security detail around a new hire. "People are talking," Angela said. "Sal's people specifically. They want to know why the boss has a car parked outside some pregnant widow's apartment every morning. It's making people nervous, Nico. It's making Sal nervous. Let it make him nervous." "That's not an answer. If Sal thinks you're protecting a witness, he's not going to wait around to find out what she remembers. He's going to act first." Nico knew Angela was right, and it cracked something loose in him. The first hard proof that his protection meant to keep Grace safe had instead accelerated the exact danger he was trying to shield her from. Sal wasn't a stupid man. If he felt cornered, he would move to eliminate the threat before it could fully materialize, and the threat now had a name and a due date and nowhere else in the world to run. Nico found Grace that evening at the bakery, closing up alone, flowers still on her hands. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to be honest because you asked me for the truth and I intend to keep giving it to you even when it's hard to hear. Just say it. My protection has made Sal suspicious. He knows something's being investigated. He doesn't know it's you specifically, not yet, but it's only a matter of time before he does the math. Nico kept his voice level even as everything in him wanted to soften it. Going back to your apartment alone isn't safe anymore. I want to move you somewhere I can actually guard properly. Grace's jaw tightened, the same fierce independence Nico had come to recognize as fundamental to who she was. And if I say no? Then I'll find another way to keep you safe that doesn't involve moving you, Nico said. But I'm asking you to consider it, because I don't think either of us wants to find out what happens if I'm wrong about how much time we have. She was silent for a long moment, one hand resting instinctively on her stomach, weighing an independence she'd fought hard to protect against a danger that had just become sharply, terrifyingly real. If I do this, she said finally, it's on my terms. I keep my own keys. I keep my own schedule. I'm not a prisoner, Nico, even if I'm scared. The second this starts feeling like a cage instead of protection, I walk and you don't stop me. Agreed, Nico said without hesitation, something in his chest loosening at how easily he meant it. Those are fair terms. I'll hold on to them. She studied him for a long moment, searching for the lie she half expected and didn't find. Okay, she said quietly. Then let's go. Neither of them spoke on the walk to his car, both of them aware that whatever fragile safety they'd built over 2 careful weeks had just tipped irreversibly into something far more dangerous, and far more binding, than either had planned for. The apartment above the bakery was small but solid, reinforced locks, a guard rotating discreetly on the street below, windows that didn't face the parking lot where it had all started. Grace moved in with 2 suitcases and a crib she insisted on assembling herself, refusing Theo's offer to help with a firmness that made Nico, watching from the doorway, smile despite the tension of everything else. Scene 1 came the next morning, practical and unremarkable in the way that mattered most. Grace found Nico in the bakery kitchen before dawn, unable to sleep, attempting badly to replicate a sourdough recipe he'd apparently been failing at for years. You're overproofing it, she said, taking the bowl from him without asking. And you're using the wrong flour. I've been making this recipe wrong for a decade. You've been making it exactly wrong enough that I can tell you learned it from someone who loved you and never explained the details properly. She worked the dough with quiet competence. My grandmother did the same thing. Taught by feel, never by measurement. Made her recipes impossible to steal, but also impossible to actually learn. Sounds like a smart woman. She was. Something flickered across Grace's face. Old grief settling briefly and passing. She's who taught me that some things are worth doing right even when nobody's watching. I think about that a lot lately. Nico watched her hands work, steady despite everything, and felt something shift quietly into place. Not attraction exactly, not yet, but recognition, the particular kind that comes from watching someone carry weight without letting it break them. Scene 2 arrived 3 days later, an argument sharper than either of them expected. Nico told her, over dinner, that he wanted to place a second guard inside the apartment itself, not just on the street. Absolutely not, Grace said immediately. I agreed to a car outside. I did not agree to a stranger standing in my living room while I went into labor. Grace, if Sal moves before we have proof. Then we get proof faster or we find another way, but you don't get to keep expanding what protection means every time you get nervous. Her voice rose, genuine fury cutting through her usual careful restraint. I watched my mother lose herself to a man who called every restriction he placed on her, protection. I'm not doing that again. Not for you, not for anyone, not even scared out of my mind like I am right now. Nico sat back, absorbing the force of it, and made himself actually listen instead of arguing back on instinct. You're right, he said finally quietly. I keep doing this, deciding what's safest without asking what you can actually live with. I don't know how to do this any other way yet. Tell me what would work instead. Grace's fury softened slightly at the honesty of the concession. The street guard stays. Nobody comes inside unless I invite them. If you're worried about something specific, tell me exactly what it is and let me decide how to respond to it. Don't just decide for me because it's faster. Done, Nico said, and this time he meant it completely. Scene 3 came on the 6th night, when Grace found him alone on the bakery's back stairwell. A glass of wine he wasn't drinking held loosely in one hand, his composure worn thin in a way she hadn't seen before. My father built this family on the idea that loyalty solves everything, Nico said before she'd even asked. Sal was the first man he ever trusted outside blood. Sal taught me half of what I know about running this business. If what you told me is true, if his crew killed your husband over pocket change during a routine collection, then everything I thought I understood about loyalty in this family is a lie I've been telling myself for a decade. Grace sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. That's not your fault, Nico. Isn't it? I built an organization where a man like Sal felt safe enough to do something like that and assume it would never touch me. That's not an accident. That's a structure I built, whether I meant to or not. Then you fix the structure, Grace said simply. Not by pretending it didn't happen. By making sure whatever comes next, it's not built on the same silence that let it happen the first time. He looked at her, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. You lost everything because of a decision my organization made, and you're the one telling me how to fix it. I'm not doing it for you, Grace said, echoing without meaning to the same fierce independence that had defined every choice she'd made since Daniel died. I'm doing it because Daniel deserves the truth, and my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where the people who did this actually answer for it. If that happens to also fix something broken in your family, that's not me being generous. That's just what the truth does when you finally let it out. They sat in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the December cold sharp beyond the stairwell door, and something passed between them that wasn't yet romance but was undeniably its foundation. Two people who'd both learned the hard way that survival required more courage than anyone gave it credit for. It was Theo who broke the moment, jogging up the back stairs, face tight with urgency. Nico, he said. Supply delivery just came in early, Grace's shift, not mine. Sal's in the building. He asked specifically where she was. Grace's blood went cold. Nico was already moving, adrenaline sharpening every instinct he had. Where is she supposed to be right now? The loading dock, Theo said. Alone. Grace hadn't made it to the loading dock yet. She was 2 floors up in the apartment, when she heard Sal Marchetti's voice through the thin wall separating the stairwell from Nico's downstairs office. She froze, hand on the doorframe, recognizing the voice instantly, viscerally, the same ugly, careless laugh she'd carried in her memory for 6 months. It was him. One of the 2 men who'd run from that parking garage the night Daniel died. She'd never seen his face clearly that night, just silhouette and streetlight and terror, but the voice was unmistakable, burned into her memory in a way faces sometimes weren't. She'd spent 6 months believing she might never be certain enough to say a name out loud. Now she was certain beyond any doubt. She called Nico's cell with shaking hands, voice barely above a whisper. It's him. So. I recognize his voice. He's one of the men from that night. Nico, 3 floors down and 1 room away from the man he'd trusted for a decade, felt something in his chest go glacially cold. Stay where you are. Do not come downstairs. But Sal, sharp-eyed and paranoid after weeks of noticing a security detail he didn't understand, caught something in Nico's sudden distraction. A tension that hadn't been there a moment before, and made the connection Nico had been desperately trying to prevent. The bakery girl, Sal said slowly. The pregnant one. She's the reason for all this, isn't she? Nico said nothing, which was answer enough. Sal's expression shifted, calculation replacing the easy familiarity of a decade's friendship. Whatever she thinks she remembers, Nico, it's not worth blowing up this family over. So you admit there's something to remember. The silence that followed told Nico everything the financial records had only suggested. Sal moved fast, faster than Nico expected from a man his age, heading not toward the door but toward the stairwell, toward Grace. Nico followed immediately, shouting for Theo, every protective instinct in him narrowing to a single point of focus. He was too slow by half a floor. By the time he reached the landing, Sal had already cornered Grace near the supply closet where the bakery kept its delivery inventory, one hand gripping her arm hard enough to bruise, his voice low and urgent. You don't say a word to anyone, Sal said. Not about that night, not about anything. You understand me? Have a family too. I have grandkids. I am not losing everything because some widow got a lucky look at my face 6 months ago. Let go of me, Grace said, voice shaking but not breaking, one hand instinctively curling protectively around her stomach. Give me your word and this ends quietly. I'm not giving you anything. Grace's mind, even now, even terrified, was working the way it always had under pressure, cataloging details, building the case she'd need if she survived this conversation. I remember the delivery gloves you were wearing that night. Black with a supplier tag stitched into the cuff. The same brand this bakery orders from, the same brand your crew uses for collection runs. I kept that detail to myself for 6 months because I didn't think anyone would believe a scared, grieving woman's memory of a glove tag in bad lighting. But I never forgot it. And if you check the inventory records for that week, Sal, you'll find exactly which crew was issued gloves from that batch and exactly when. Sal's grip tightened, panic replacing calculation. That's not proof of anything. It's proof of premeditation, Grace said, steadier now, the trembling in her voice giving way to something harder. A robbery gone wrong doesn't come with matched inventory-tagged gloves. That's planning. That's exactly the kind of detail a jury remembers. Sal's hand moved toward his jacket and Grace's whole body tensed, bracing. But before he could finish the motion, Nico was there, physically hauling him back and away from her with a violence that startled even his own men, Theo right behind him, weapon already drawn. Don't, Nico said, voice absolutely lethal, positioning himself fully between Sal and Grace. Don't you dare finish that motion. Sal, cornered now, exposed, made one last desperate appeal. 10 years, Nico. 10 years I've stood beside you. You're going to throw that away for a woman you've known for a month. I'm not throwing it away, Nico said, something in his voice breaking and hardening at once. You threw it away the night you killed an innocent man over pocket change and let me believe it was random for 6 months. I built my life around the idea that loyalty meant something in this family. You just proved it never did, not to you. Theo secured Sal's weapon and restrained him against the wall, and in the sudden ringing silence afterward, Grace found herself shaking, adrenaline draining out fast enough to leave her legs unsteady. Nico caught her before she could fully sink to the floor, one arm around her, careful of the baby, his voice dropping into something raw and urgent. Are you hurt? Grace, look at me, is the baby okay? I'm okay, she managed. We're okay. He held on to her a beat longer than strictly necessary, and neither of them acknowledged it, both too shaken by how close the last 90 seconds had come to ending everything. What happens now? Grace asked once her breathing had steadied. Nico looked at Sal, a decade of loyalty, restrained and furious against the wall, staring back at him with something between betrayal and desperation. Now, Nico said, I decide whether I'm the kind of man who buries this quietly to protect my own family's reputation, or the kind of man who finally does the right thing, no matter what it costs me. He didn't answer his own question yet. But Grace, watching his face, understood that whatever he chose next was going to change both their lives permanently. The choice came down 2 days later in Nico's office, with Sal restrained in the back room and every senior member of the family gathered to hear what their boss intended to do. We handle this internally, argued Frank Costa, Nico's oldest surviving captain, gray-haired and rigid with the certainty of decades of precedent. It's how it's always been done. We don't hand our own to the police. That's not loyalty, Nico, that's suicide for the whole organization. Every family in this city will smell weakness. An innocent man is dead, Nico said, standing at the head of the table, every eye in the room on him. A woman is 6 weeks from giving birth and spent 6 months terrified for her life because Sal Marchetti decided a pocket change robbery was worth more than a stranger's life. If handling that internally means burying it, means letting Sal walk with a slap on the wrist and a quiet reassignment somewhere upstate, then I'm not interested in what's always been done. You'll fracture this family, Frank warned. Men who've been loyal to Sal for years won't forgive this. Then they can leave, Nico said, and the finality in his voice silenced the room. I built this organization to protect the people in it, not to protect the worst decisions anyone in it makes. If loyalty means covering for a man who murdered someone in cold blood, I don't want that loyalty. I'd rather have a smaller family that actually means what it claims to stand for. It was, Grace would understand later, the single most costly decision Nico had made in 11 years running the family. Not the danger of confronting Sal directly, but the deliberate public fracturing of the loyalty structure that had protected his organization for a decade. 2 captains walked out that same afternoon, taking men and territory with them, furious at what they saw as a betrayal of the family's oldest code. Nico let them go without argument, absorbing a loss that would take years to rebuild because the alternative, protecting Sal to protect his own position, was a version of himself he refused to become. He called the police himself. Handed over the financial records, the inventory logs, everything his quiet investigation had uncovered, framing it not as an admission of the family's darker business but as a private citizen reporting a violent crime committed by an employee acting entirely outside his authorization. It wasn't the whole truth. It was enough truth to matter. Grace's testimony sealed it. She sat across from a detective 2 days later and described, calmly and precisely, everything she remembered. The men running from the garage, the voice she'd recognized through a wall, the glove tag that matched an inventory record now sitting in an evidence file with her name on the report that had cross-referenced it. Her hands didn't shake this time. 6 months of carrying that memory alone had left her steadier than she expected, once she was finally allowed to put it down. "You didn't have to help me build the case against him," the detective said afterward. "A lot of witnesses in your position walk away rather than testify against someone connected to organized crime." "He killed my husband," Grace said simply. "I'm not walking away from that so somebody else can decide it doesn't matter." The aftermath moved fast once the machinery of it started. Sal was formally charged within the week. The inventory records, Nico's financial documentation and Grace's testimony together constructing a case solid enough that no amount of old loyalty could soften it. He would stand trial for a crime that had gone unsolved for 6 months, and this time, there would be no quiet closing of the file. Nico's organization, meanwhile, absorbed the wound of Sal's exposure exactly as Frank had warned. 2 captains are gone. A dozen men reassigned or quietly departed, unwilling to work for a boss who'd chosen an outsider's justice over the family's old code. Nico spent long nights rebuilding trust from the ground up, meeting personally with every remaining captain, explaining not just what he'd done but why, refusing to apologize for a decision he stood behind completely. "You lost a decade of loyalty for me," Grace said, finding him alone in the bakery office one evening, exhausted in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "I lost a decade of loyalty for the truth," Nico corrected gently. "You were just the reason I finally had the courage to act on it. I'd been building an organization on Sal's kind of silence for years without fully understanding what it was costing. This was overdue whether you'd ever walked through my door or not." "That's a generous way of looking at it." "It's the honest way," he said. "I'm trying to get better at that." Grace studied him. A man who'd sacrificed real, tangible power to give her back a truth she'd spent 6 months afraid to speak aloud, and felt something shift in her chest, something she hadn't let herself feel since before Daniel died. "Nico," she said carefully, "why did you actually do all this? The protection, the investigation, choosing me over 10 years of loyalty. You could have found a version of this that protected your organization without costing you nearly this much." "I could have," he admitted. "I told myself for weeks it was about doing right by your husband's memory." "That's true, but it isn't the whole truth." He met her eyes directly, something unguarded in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. "The whole truth is that somewhere in the last month, watching you refuse every easy way out, watching you choose the truth even when it terrified you, I stopped seeing you as a problem to solve and started seeing you as someone I very badly didn't want to lose. I don't know what to do with that yet. I'm not asking you to know what to do with it either. I just didn't want to keep pretending it wasn't true." Grace was quiet for a long moment, one hand resting on her stomach, weighing the weight of everything he'd just admitted against 6 months of learning, painfully, not to trust anyone's promises. "I need you to understand something too," she said finally. "I am not staying in Providence working in this bakery being close to you because you saved me. I've spent my whole life being someone men decided to save, and it never once actually gave me anything real. If I stay, it has to be because I'm choosing it, not because I owe you, not because you're safer than being alone, but because it's actually what I want." "That's exactly what I want too," Nico said. "Whatever you choose next, Grace, it has to be entirely yours. I'll live with whatever that turns out to be." Grace gave birth 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, to a daughter she named Daniela, after the father who never got to meet her. Nico wasn't in the delivery room. That boundary Grace had made clear belonged to her closest friend from the diner and no one else. But he was in the waiting room the entire night, and when Grace finally emerged, exhausted and radiant and holding her daughter for the first time, he was the first person outside her small circle of real friends that she wanted to see. She's beautiful, he said, careful and quiet, keeping a respectful distance despite everything unspoken between them. She has Daniel's eyes, Grace said, and for the first time in 6 months, saying his name out loud didn't feel like reopening a wound. It felt like honoring one and being able finally to move forward alongside the grief instead of buried under it. Sal Marchetti's trial concluded 2 months later. The evidence, Grace's testimony, the inventory records, Nico's financial documentation, was airtight enough that the case never even needed to go before a full jury. Sal accepted a plea deal that would keep him behind bars for the remainder of his working life. Nico's organization, smaller now and rebuilt on terms he'd chosen deliberately rather than inherited by default, settled into a new equilibrium that Frank Costa, to his own visible surprise, eventually admitted felt more honest than anything that had come before it. Grace returned to the bakery 3 weeks after Daniela's birth, not because she needed the job desperately anymore. Nico had quietly ensured, through channels she couldn't easily refuse, that her medical bills were settled and a modest trust existed for her daughter's future, structured carefully enough that Grace understood it wasn't an attempt to buy her gratitude, just an old debt finally being paid honestly, but because she wanted to be there. Because the bakery and the man who ran it had become something she chose rather than something she'd been forced into. One evening, closing up together, Daniela asleep in a carrier against Grace's chest, Nico found the fake watch she still wore on a thin chain. The one she'd bought to replace the one stolen the night Daniel died. "You still wear it," he said. "I always will," Grace said. "It's not about holding on to grief. It's about remembering that even when everything falls apart, you can still choose to build something honest out of what's left." She looked at him, something soft and certain in her expression that hadn't been there the first day she'd walked into his office, terrified and pregnant and asking for any job he'd give her. "That's what you did too when you chose the truth over 10 years of easy loyalty. I see that watch and I see Daniel. But I also see everything since, everything you gave up to make this right. I didn't do it to earn anything from you," Nico said. "I know," Grace said. "That's exactly why I'm still here. You never once tried to make me owe you for it." She reached for his hand, deliberate, unhurried, entirely her own choice. "I'm choosing to stay, Nico. Not because you protected me. Because you gave me my life back and then you let me decide what to build with it." He laced his fingers through hers, something in his chest finally, fully settling. "Then let's build it," he said, "together on whatever terms you need." She smiled, full and real, the first one he'd seen from her that carried no fear underneath it, and kissed him soft and certain, sealing a choice made freely by two people who'd both learned at great cost, the real difference between being saved and being given back the right to save yourself. Grace still wears that watch every day. She still runs the bakery counter some mornings, Daniela growing up surrounded by flour dust and the quiet, steady presence of a man who learned that real protection means giving someone their choices back, not making all their choices for them. If this story stayed with you, I want to know what you think. Was Grace right to stay once she learned the man protecting her was connected to her husband's death, or should she have walked away the moment she found out? Tell me your honest answer in the comments and why you believe it. The stories about ordinary women earning real strength and real love resonate with you. Subscribe. The next one is coming soon.